When Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015, he was hailed as a rock star politician. Young, charismatic and social media savvy, he's been celebrated as a feminist, a defender of the environment and standing up for the rights of minority groups. But there's also been a lot of criticism recently following his controversial trip to India. So has the shine gone off? In a wide-ranging interview, the young leader talks to me about his image, his relationship with President Trump, and his plans to strengthen trade ties with the UK.
Prime Minister, the Commonwealth heads of government are in London this week and to discuss relations. And for Britain, trade is high on the agenda. What's on offer from Canada?
Well, we're looking, of course, to have a seamless transition as we go from the CETA deal that we just signed with the entire European Union, including Great Britain, obviously, to having a version of CETA that is standalone that will flip over the day after Brexit. So we're very happy with trade with Britain. It's our largest trading partner in the European Union, and we'll look to make sure there's predictability and continuity.
I mean, speaking of trade, the majority of your country's trade is done with the United States and Mexico. President Trump wants the NAFTA deal signed as soon as possible. Deal or no deal, Prime Minister?
It depends on what happens at the table. Obviously, we're looking at a level of positive momentum and enthusiasm as we approach sort of deadlines around both the Mexican elections that are about to kick off and the US midterms, which means they'd love to get it through Congress before summer. So we see the coming weeks as an opportunity to really dig in and see if we can get to that win-win-win. I'm optimistic we will. We've had a good run on trade deals Canada has, so we're feeling great about trade, and we're optimistic about NAFTA, even though we know there's going to be a lot of hard talking in the coming weeks.
And there is hard talking. Are you concerned about President Trump's threats that he may pull out?
We've been working constructively with this administration for over a year now. There is always a certain amount of rhetorical flourish around the way the president operates. We stay focused on the getting things done that'll be good for Canada and good for the United States.
And what would it mean if it collapsed?
I'm not worried about that. I'm very much focused on how we're going to move forward. The ties that exist between Canada and the United States are so complex and multi-layered that I am very confident we're going to stay in a good place.
You talk about win-win, but how can you have a win-win situation when you're dealing with an administration that believes in protectionism, for example, and is stoking fears of a trade war?
Well, you start with a simple principle that says both the president and I are looking to create benefit for the largest number of people, particularly folks in our countries that have felt left out of the kind of growth and progress we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years. If we can actually work together to create and enhance jobs, then that's what we're going to do. And looking for that common ground is always what I've approached the president on. There's areas where we disagree, and he knows my job is to stand up for Canadian interests, and he gets that.
Dealing with him, is it challenging?
Any relationship amongst leaders is challenging. You have to.
But there's been nothing like this. I mean, we haven't seen this sort of modus operandi before. I mean, do you find that challenging?
Canada's relationship with the United States is always one of the most important things for any Canadian Prime Minister to deal with, and every era brings its own challenges. This is certainly a particular time. People recognize that. The President prides himself on a level of disruption and unpredictability that is challenging certain aspects of global systems that we've perhaps taken for granted, and it does keep me on my toes. But we have a good working relationship because that's what Canadians expect me to do.
The UN Secretary General has said the Cold War is back with a vengeance, and the mechanisms that were in place to prevent the escalation of conflict are no longer there. Do you agree with that?
I think we're living in a time where we're seeing very different stresses and conflicts than we had in my father's time or even a decade ago. That's why we have to be thoughtful about how we pull together as a global community to deal with challenges, whether it's significant countries no longer playing by the international rules-based order, or whether it's economic pressures coming out of Asia.
How do you deal with a problem like Russia?
I think the first part is demonstrating strength and solidarity amongst the international community. I think Vladimir Putin is someone who plays on power structures and strength, and seeing a strong and concerted response from the international community. I think he was taken aback by how vehemently the international community responded to the terrible attacks in Salisbury. I mean, that was absolutely irresponsible and illegal of Russia to have engaged that way, and there were immediate and direct consequences. And I think continuing to demonstrate that there is a strong will within the international community to push back against their actions.
You say it's taken him aback, but do you think it's likely to change Russia's behavior?
I'm not going to get into predicting or analyzing what he does or what Russia does in general. I do think, however, that a strong, unified response by the international community to stand up for the rules that we've long established, like you don't use chemical weapons against civilians, against your own country in the case of Syria, or against someone else's country, like the Salisbury attack. That, for me, is something that we have to show that no, we will not accept that, and there will be consequences, and we will stand firmly.
But if you look at the airstrikes on Syria, for example, do you think they accomplished anything?
I think they managed to degrade the ability of Syria to continue to deliver chemical weapons on its own civilians. And I think that's what the direct and explicit point of those airstrikes were, and it was very targeted on that level. But of course, as we move forward, the solutions are diplomatic and political, but having had a clear response from the international community that that's a line that must not be crossed, is again a very strong signal.
But it hasn't changed the course of the war, for example, and it certainly hasn't changed Russia's behavior.
It wasn't about changing the course of the war. It wasn't about regime change. It was very much about saying the use of chemical weapons is something that is going to be met with a very clear and strong response from the international community. Now, ideally, it would happen through the Security Council, but as you pointed out, the structures that used to hold well in terms of how we work, with Russia simply playing a spoiler role at the Security Council, means we actually didn't have many other choices then to have a direct and measured response.
When you wake up in the morning and you see a tweet like, "Get ready, Russia, the missiles are coming," how do you feel?
There's a lot of rhetoric that goes on. I focus on the substance. I focus on the great relationship that Canada has with our allied partners.
But when you look at your phone, do you sort of think anything?
Well, I was in a situation of having had a heads up through our military and security cooperations
that those tweets were coming out?
That they were looking at a strong and measured response. So I knew that what was going on in the substance of things was on a track that could be illustrated by a tweet. But
so that approach,
I don't spend a lot of time focusing on Twitter. I tend to focus on the actual substance.
Do you feel you've got any influence over President Trump?
I think we've established a very good constructive relationship where we can talk about important issues, and he listens.
You have rebranded Canada. Certainly your personal brand has played a huge role in that. What are some of the downsides of that?
Well, I think one of the things that I try to point out and remind people of is Canada didn't suddenly change when we had an election 2 years ago. Canadians didn't radically change their approach. There's always been Canadians engaged around the world in diplomacy and in development, in innovation and business.
But your brand, I mean, people took notice when you entered the international stage.
I was able to pull together sort of general perceptions that people had around Canada and focus them and lift them up a little bit in a way that as the world was going in a particular direction, stood out a bit. And I think people paying a little more attention to Canada and to Canadians and what we're doing is a good thing.
But there have been downsides to that, have there not? I mean, if you look at your recent trip to India, for example, there was a lot of criticism.
When you're a politician, you get criticism for just about anything you do, whether it's successful or less successful. I try to stay focused not on the criticism or the openness to criticism, but on the doing of actual substantive things. The India trip was a great moment to connect with a very strong diaspora. It was an opportunity to sign significant deals with investors in a bilateral way in Canada and India, and we ended up creating good jobs in Canada and in India through that trip.
There was once a point where the dancing and the outfit changes did have appeal.
I don't think of things in terms of, oh, is this going to go viral or not? I think of things in terms of, how do I want to engage and what is authentic to how we engage with the world. And for me, giving I have a constituency in Montreal where there's a strong Indian community, and I'm regularly at their celebrations and engage with them. For me, continuing that in India was something that was natural and was a reflection of the deep connections between our country. People can criticize and can take what they wish from it. But again, the deepening of the relationship was a very positive thing.
Because one of the criticisms was that with the novelty gone, there's little substance.
I think when the economic approach we've had is actually successfully signed trade deals around the world at a time where anti-trade and anti-globalization movements are everywhere, creating the highest growth rate in the G7 right now in Canada. Well, 2017 was the best year in the G7 in Canada because we're doing things like lowering taxes for the middle class and raising them on the wealthiest 1%, giving generous child benefit checks to middle class and low-income families. We're actually creating substantive progress for Canadians in a way that is not just good for us as a country, but it's countering a lot of the populist anxiety that's out there, and that's very much what I'm focused on. I'm going to stay focused on, and I'll let opinion folks opine on what it is they want. I'm going to keep delivering for Canadians.
But have you learned lessons from these things, these experiences?
I think if you don't learn every day on how to do things better, then you won't evolve as a leader, and you won't be able to be there to respond to people. I'm always going to reflect on what we do and how we can do better next time.
Can I just briefly ask about quite a controversial pipeline, an energy project that's considered one of the most controversial in Canada's history. Do you feel that you are between a rock and a hard place, or giving up your values? No,
not at all. My values and the approach that I put forward when I got elected was we can no longer pretend there's a choice between what's good for the economy and what's good for the environment. The only way to build a responsible economy and country and environment that works for future generations is to do them both at the same time. Versus oil by rail or oil by truck, pipelines are actually much safer. And right now, we are captive to a U.S. market for our oil resources. Getting our oil responsibly to the Pacific really matters because we're, first of all, getting a big discount for our oil right now, but we're also captive to a market that, as we pointed out earlier, is a little less predictable than it has been in years past, and I think diversifying towards Asia is a good thing.
Prime Minister, thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, appreciate it.